The U.S. bishops addressed the sex abuse crisis at their annual spring meeting in Baltimore. Bishop Thomas Paprocki of Springfield, Illinois, and Auxiliary Bishop Robert Barron of Los Angeles give us their perspectives on the abuse crisis, reception of communion for politicians, and much more. Later, the editor of Catholic World News, Phil Lawler, and author and economist Jennifer ROBACK MORSE join me with in-depth analysis of the bishops' meeting and the big Catholic news of the week. The world over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Bishop Thomas Paprocki, Bishop Robert Barron, Phil Lawler, and Jennifer ROBACK MORSE are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me an email or tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. You can email me at worldover@ewtn.com. Lots to cover. First, some news. The U.S. bishops gathered in Baltimore this week for their annual spring meeting, which was focused mostly on responding to the ongoing sex abuse crisis in the wake of Theodore McCarrick and other scandals. The bishops approved a new system of reporting abuse, including the creation of a national sex abuse hotline. The hotline will be run by an independent entity and will take complaints by phone and via an online link. The information gathered would then be sent to regional metropolitan bishops. The hotline is expected to be operational within a year and has an estimated annual cost of $50,000. Joining me now with thoughts on these stories and many more from the USCCB meeting is Bishop Thomas Paprocki and later Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Paprocki, thank you for being here. Your Excellency, the Pope stymied the bishops' last attempt to address this sex abuse crisis until that global summit in Rome was completed. He has since issued a motu proprio establishing universal norms for dealing with abuse. How has that motu proprio been received by the bishops and, more importantly, by the people in your diocese?
I think it's been received pretty well, both by the bishops and the people in my diocese. You know, last November, I think we were all frustrated when the proposals that we had on the table for dealing with these issues were tabled and basically told to wait until the Holy Father had the meeting in February with the presidents of Episcopal conferences from around the world. But I think at the time what we were trying to do was fill a void. We really didn't have anything at that time, so we were coming up with our own proposals. And then we're told, well, no, the Holy Father, the Vatican are going to look at these things. And then we had the motu proprio, and so what we finally came up with and approved today are the measures that are in keeping with the instructions that we got from the Holy See.
Now, one of the guidelines in the new norms and that you all approved is the use of this metropolitan option. Now, this gives the metropolitan archbishop in a region the authority to carry out an investigation against an accused bishop. On Tuesday, Francesco Cesaro, he's the chairman of the National Review Board, reacted to that model this way.
The NRB remains uncomfortable with allowing bishops to review allegations against other bishops, as this essentially means bishops policing bishops. The Metropolitan will gain greater credibility if a lay commission is established when allegations come forward. Lay involvement is key to restoring the credibility of the Church, which includes a commitment to transparency.
Is that a credible critique? I mean, Cardinal Law, McCarrick, Mahoney, they were all metropolitans and had deep problems.
Well, I expressed my own misgivings last November when the metropolitan model was first proposed, precisely for those reasons, because, as you mentioned, allegations brought against the metropolitan could be difficult to handle. I mean, the structure is that it then goes to the senior suffragan bishop, but that's a bishop within the province of the metropolitan. What we have, though, I think at this point with this motu proprio and the model that we put into place has some safeguards, because the concern was if it just goes to the metropolitan or his senior suffragan, they could deep six it. They could say, well, we're not going anywhere with it. But I think there's some important safeguards in there. For one, that we approved just today that there would be a layperson who would also be receiving the reports. We have this third-party reporting system with a hotline, so that'll be a national toll-free number that people can call from throughout the United States, so it would be a well-identified number. So from there, it goes to the metropolitan, and it'll go to the layperson who is designated to receive the reports. It'll go to the apostolic nuncio. The nuncio forwards it to the Holy See. So I think there are enough safeguards in there that I think it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a metropolitan or her senior suffragan to simply say, I'm going to bury this, I'm not going to do anything with it.
Your Excellency, we have reported on this show over the last few years, sadly, and I'm still getting reports like this from Rome, that there are those investigations that begin, and then for whatever reason they are stymied, they put down, they just vanish. Is it unreasonable to assume that a bishop is going to be pursuing another bishop? And is there an appropriate role for the laity as part of that investigatory body? Not only being notified, but being part of an investigation, so that there's some backup notification here, and,
yes.
and someone holding the bishops and the church to account.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and so there is a role for a layperson in receiving the report initially, but then it also provides for the laity to be involved in the investigation and assessing the results of that investigation. So again, what we just proved today with our directives that implement the motu proprio vos estis lux mundi calls for the appointment of an investigator and working with a number of other consultants who are to be lay people. And so they will be very much involved. And every bishop in the United States now has had experience in his own diocese as working with review boards dealing with allegations against priests. And so every bishop, I think, is very familiar with working with lay people. We're not threatened by that. In fact, I think all of us really value the input of lay people. So that's a very prominent feature of the measures that we adopted today.
Your Excellency, during the meeting, the chairwoman of the National Advisory Council to the bishops requested that all the U.S. bishops exhort the Holy See to make public the results of both the diocesan and the archdiocesan investigations of Theodore McCarrick. Do you worry that we're too focused on McCarrick, especially considering the Michael Bransfield revelations in recent days and heaven knows what else is out there?
Well, I think all of this started about a year ago with the news about then Cardinal McCarrick being found to credibly accused of sexual misconduct with minors in the Archdiocese of New York, and then his subsequent resignation from the College of Cardinals, eventual trial, and being dismissed from the clerical state. And because he was such a high-profile figure, I think there was a lot of attention on him, as well as questions about how did he get to become a cardinal, and who knew what, and when did they know it. And so there was a lot of interest in that. The Holy Father himself promised last October that there would be a thorough investigation, and he wanted all of that to come forward. It's my understanding that that investigation is going forward, and but they want to make sure that it's very thorough, so they don't want to necessarily abbreviate it or make it too quick. But it's my understanding that that will be forthcoming.
And you would like to see the results of that made public?
Yes, I would. I think that you know, our Lord said the truth will set you free. So let's see what the truth is, and we'll deal with that.
Your Excellency, you have barred Holy Communion in your role as the Bishop of Springfield in Illinois to a Senate President, John Cullerton, as well as the Speaker of the House, Michael Madigan, because they facilitated the passage of two laws and have, quote, in your words, obstinately persisted in promoting the abominable crime and very grave sin of abortion. Do you believe this will change these politicians' views?
Well, I hope it will. This is ultimately a call for conversion. That's my most fervent hope here. I'm not trying to punish somebody and say, well, this is a permanent situation. You can no longer ever go to communion. It's a medicinal remedy in the sense that I hope that this will be a call to conversion, a call to change of heart. I don't want to see anybody permanently excluded from communion. I want to see them come back. But in order to come back to the sacraments, you have to have a change of heart. And a change of heart means that you're not only sorry for what you've done, you're going to make some effort to reverse what you did. I make the analogy to someone who's stolen $1 million and then is sorry about stealing it. You go to confession and you confess, I'm sorry, I stole $1 million. but then you can't keep it. Part of our moral theology is restitution. If you're really sorry, you got to give it back. And so similarly here, if you're really sorry, and I hope they will be sorry about the abortion measures that they have facilitated passage of, I hope that they will then introduce some legislation to, in fact, repeal them and reverse this.
Bishop Paprocki, no doubt you've heard the arguments that taking away communion, it politicizes and weaponizes the sacrament. And your critics say that you denied communion to Senator Dick Durbin for his stance on abortion, and it didn't change his position. You would say what?
I would say that's looking at this as a political strategy, and I don't intend this as a political strategy. So the situation with Dick Durbin, as you pointed out, Senator Durbin, this goes back 15 years, back when he was told by his pastor, now Bishop Kevin Vann of Orange, California, he was his pastor in Springfield, that he would be reticent to give him Holy Communion. That was upheld by my predecessor. So in effect, in a way, I'm being consistent. So the same message that I've upheld regarding Senator Durbin now applies to two other prominent politicians, Catholic politicians in our state. And I think it's not so much a question of, well, this strategy didn't work, we have to try another political strategy. I don't mean this as an intent as a political strategy. I think the most important reasons for doing this are the integrity of our faith and the integrity of our sacraments. In terms of integrity of the faith, to say, first of all, you can't, a Catholic politician cannot say that I am pro-abortion, I'm going to be pushing for abortion to be legal in this country, and at the same time I'm a good Catholic in good standing. Those positions are incompatible. Also in terms of the integrity of the sacraments, to receive Holy Communion is a very sacred thing, and anyone who is aware of grave sin is not to approach Holy Communion. And so there are actually two different canons that I talked about here. That Canon 916 is the obligation of any person. If you are aware of having committed a grave sin, you should go to confession, confess your sins, repent, receive absolution, then you go to communion. Canon 915 is the one I applied to these two legislative leaders because of their very prominent role not only in supporting and voting for this legislation, but in fact facilitating its passage through the legislature. So they've been obstinate in the sense of they have been very stubborn about this, persistent. It's at least these two bills over the last 2 years that have been very strongly pushing abortion. The one 2 years ago provided taxpayer funding of abortion. The one just passed a couple of weeks ago says that abortion is a fundamental right, and the unborn baby has no independent rights outside of the mother's womb. And so it is persistent, and it is a manifest grave sin. So in a case like that, it's incumbent upon the authority to make this declaration that that person should not be admitted to Holy Communion.
Your Excellency, is it frustrating to you? I thought the agreement between the bishops was that, and I'm going back years, in fact, I'm going back to when Pope Benedict was Ratzinger and wrote that letter to all the bishops, which amazingly Theodore McCarrick was the messenger of. And I thought at that time the bishops decided if the ordinary where the person resides or where they operate, if they deny them communion, the other bishops would respect that. It doesn't seem as if that is now being adhered to. I'm now reading reports of bishops saying, well, your prohibition on communion for these politicians only applies to the Diocese of Springfield and no further. Doesn't that break the bonds of unity?
Well, we did say back in 2004 in our statements on Catholics and political life that each individual bishop could legitimately make his own prudent decisions in these matters. And so, unfortunately, there was not consensus 15 years ago when we adopted that. I would also say, though, and by the way, my decree did say that it applies specifically within the Diocese of Springfield, because I wanted to leave that decision to the prudential judgment of the local bishop. But I think 15 years ago, the reticence on the part of bishops was because the politicians at that time were still very hesitant to be proclaiming their support for abortion very loudly. They would say things like, using former President Bill Clinton's line, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And they don't use the word rare very much anymore. In fact, just the opposite. When these bills passed in Illinois, the proponents of the bills were giving each other high fives and hugging each other and celebrating. We're going to have more abortions, as if this were a good thing. And so I think what I'm hearing from some of my brother bishops is that they've applauded me and supported me for what I've done, but I think they're also seeing that the whole climate in the nation is changing now, where abortion is being pushed so strongly that perhaps our response needs to be stronger as well.
Bishop Thomas Paprocki, I thank you for your time, for your candor, and I hope you'll come back.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Thank you, Bishop. Also from Baltimore with his analysis of the spring meeting is Auxiliary Bishop of Los Angeles, Bishop Robert Barron. He joins me now. Your Excellency, thank you for being here. Now, you addressed what you described as the second most important issue facing the church in the U.S. right now, and that is the number of people who are leaving the Catholic Church. They are, or part of them are, the nones. Those are the unaffiliated. I want to share some statistics that you brought up at the meeting on Tuesday. You said that 50% of millennial Catholics have left the church. 1 out of 6 millennials in America is now a former Catholic, and 6.4 leave the church for every 1 that joins. Why are they leaving, Bishop Barron?
Well, a whole variety of reasons. And that last statistic, by the way, is one that stays most vividly in my mind. I told the bishops, think of all the rights of election and so on. For every 1 person that joins, 6.45 are leaving. What always strikes me, Raymond, in the surveys, the number one reason given by young people themselves is we no longer believe the teachings of the church. So we might have an instinct to say, oh, it's because of all the scandals, et cetera. And they do play a role in the surveys. But number one, they don't believe in the great narrative and the great doctrines of Christianity. Closely related to that is the conflict between religion and science. In the minds of a lot of young people, science means rationality, period. And that rationality and religion seem to be at odds with each other. So I said to the bishops, in some way, it's the bitter fruit, I think, of the dumbing down of the faith that's been going on for the past 50 years or so in our very bad, catechesis. And you hear it now in the young people who say, we just don't believe the operation. That's a number one reason. I think the culture of relativism plays a big role. The culture related to that of self-invention. If I decide what's true, I decide what's good, that's going to be at odds necessarily with a church that speaks boldly for objective truth and objective moral value. Certainly in the surveys you do indeed find the scandals, et cetera.
Right.
And, in wake of the McCarrick situation, that probably has gotten worse, but we don't have the survey information quite yet on that. But I think the primacy of the intellectual problems are worth paying attention to.
You write in your book, Letter to a Suffering Church, that, quote, the devil, with the cooperation of lots of people inside the leadership of the Catholic Church, has produced a masterpiece. And many, many Catholics are angry and naturally tempted to give up on this operation. How much do you attribute the abuse crisis and the bishop's inability or unwillingness to engage this problem? How has that impacted this exodus of the faithful?
It has. And again, you can see it in the surveys done over the past, let's say, 20 years. We've been going through different phases of the scandal for the past 20 years. So it's there. As I say, I don't think we have really good data yet on the immediate, post-McCarrick situation.
What's your gut, though?
But certainly it hasn't helped. My gut says certainly has not helped, and I think it has contributed to a growing alienation. That's why, taking these practical steps that we've taken the past many months, and especially just yesterday and today, are very important to restore credibility. But we just got to look long and hard at this crisis in its various dimensions.
Your Excellency, as you may know, I write now for middle grade kids. I spend a lot of time in schools. The thing that struck me and shocked me in your presentation is you found that the median age of those leaving the church are 13 years old. Now, 13 seems very young. Is there a problem the way children are being taught about faith and religion? You alluded to it earlier. The great narrative of the church, a sense of the supernatural, wonder, awe, a battle between good and evil, and maybe lousy storytelling has played a role. Your thoughts?
Yep. Yeah, not only are the children getting younger, they're getting more conscious in their choice. So the studies are showing that younger and younger Catholics are saying, I consciously am opting out. One thing I mentioned to the bishops, I've been saying it for a long time, look at the new atheists, Hitchens and Dawkins, Sam Harris and company. Almost every day in my internet work, I run across their disciples, people that took their arguments very seriously. Those fellas didn't, hug people into atheism. They argued them into atheism. If we meet that with a very weak intellectual response, the kids say, well, look, these are smart people. They're advocating for no God. Unless I hear some good counter arguments, I'm going to be persuaded. Yeah. And I think increasingly that's happening, and the surveys show it.
You raised a potential lesson for the bishops. You called it the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. And now he's a professor out of Canada.
Yeah.
He's got a huge online following. Why are young men listening to him, and what can the church learn from him?
Yeah, and I was careful to say, when I brought up Peterson's name, I wasn't, advocating everything he's ever said and done. Yeah. I said it's the phenomenon of Peterson. That is to say, a very smart, articulate man with no, whiz-bang special effects. And he's not a especially, rhetorically compelling figure, speaking in a high, serious way about important ideas. And he's getting tens of thousands in arenas and millions online. And I said, I think there's a lesson for all of us in that. As we've been dumbing down the operation for a long time, we've been underplaying what our young people are capable of. This has borne some bitter fruit. And I think from someone like Peterson and others too, we can learn a lesson. We should bring our very smart tradition forward. We should do it in a confident way and stop dumbing it down and stop underestimating what young people are capable of. I've been saying for years, Raymond, our high school kids are reading Shakespeare, and if they're Latin students, they're reading Virgil. They're studying, high-level calculus, and then we give them comic books for religion. So we've been dumbing it down and underplaying what the kids are capable of. Yeah. So I think we see the bitter fruits of that.
Well, Massimo Fagioli, who's a theologian, has ridiculed you for invoking Peterson. But I got the idea when you mentioned him, because you have a whole generation of young men who don't know what it means to be a man. And Peterson is saying, look, this is the tried and tested way forward. Try this. And it seems there's no one in the church, at least not passionately, vociferously, jumping into that fray, aside from you and a handful of others. What's the missing link here? I have to tell you, watching the Bishops' Conference, Your Excellency, I'm not filled with hope. There's not a lot of passion or zeal in the room.
Well, I think to be fair, it's a business meeting, and so we're trying to deal with these things in kind of a sober way. It's not a time for, exhortative preaching and so on. But that is part of it, Raymond. You're right, we believe this in our bones. We know it's beautiful, we know it's compelling, we know it's true, and say it. And something else about Peterson, he speaks, especially to young men, in a direct, forthright, and challenging way.
Correct.
Stand up straight and get your lives together and do what you know to be right, and stop making excuses.
Right.
Well, that's not a bad set of commands, And I think the church classically has played that role. But if we're too reticent about that, then of course young people, they don't follow the uncertain trumpet, as they say. Years ago, there was a student of mine at Mundelein Seminary. He said what we were missing in our formation was Yoda on our shoulders. And he remember from Star Wars, when Yoda gets on the shoulders of Luke Skywalker and begins to tell him what to do and command him and move him through his paces. And he was a master to an apprentice. And the student of mine said, that's what we need. We need masters to whom we can apprentice. And I think in his own way, I think Peterson has played that role to a degree with young men. Yeah. And again, that's not to say, I hereby endorse everything Jordan Peterson has said and done. But that dimension of it, I think, is worth paying attention to.
Yeah. What approaches have you found effective in engaging with these so-called nons, these people who are, they don't identify any religion?
I try the Augustinian method, by which I mean appeal to the restless heart. So everybody knows deep down, as they're seeking truth and seeking goodness and beauty, that nothing in this world is sufficient. And the longer you live, the more clear that becomes to you. So I try to appeal to that, say that religion is all about this final lure of the mind and the will, this infinite truth and infinite goodness that alone can satisfy your will. Second thing I'd say, Raymond, is I engage them in frank and straightforward intellectual conversation and debate. Someone comes at me with an objection to the faith, well, good. I love that. I got some traction now. And I can come back with a counter-argument. Don't dumb it down. Don't underplay what they're capable of. I think a third thing is what Pope Francis calls the via pulchritudinis, right? The way of beauty. And we're a true religion. We're also a very beautiful religion. And the beautiful can be a more non-threatening way in. So to just hold up some of the beauty, literary, architectural, painting, sculptural, in our great tradition. I say those three things I've tried.
I have to ask you before I let you go, there's a new Pew survey out. It found that 27% of Catholics say they have gone to Mass less often in response to the sex abuse reports. 26% say they've reduced donations. What would you tell them? And what do you say to Catholics, Your Excellency, who see the Michael Bransfield $1 million tributes being paid to other clerics, major archdioceses spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to wage a legal fight over Fulton Sheen's dead body, or the billions in sex abuse settlements? Why should they give to a diocese?
Well, knowing full well that money, yes, there are abuses, but that money at its best goes to very good things. And I hope the Catholic people know that. I'd also say, in light of Vatican II, the worst thing you can possibly do is stay away from Mass, the source and summit of the Christian life. So if in, out of concern for scandals in the church, I stop going to Mass, I mean, that's just undermining my own spiritual life. What I argue in the book you referenced is the treasure's always been in earthen vessels, from Paul's time to our time. The vessels are fragile. They're weak. They're broken in some cases, but the treasure remains, and you stay Catholic because of the treasure. Given that, there's no good reason ever for leaving the church. I can understand people's reaction, but there's never an objectively good reason for staying away from the source of life. So I would say that's just, in a way, punishing yourself. Yeah. Yes, raise your voice in protest. Yes, demand change, etc. Yes, express your indignation. But to stay away from the sacraments, to me, that's spiritually self-defeating.
Yeah. I have to share this with you. Bishop Baker of Birmingham rose at one point during the bishops' conference, and I have to say, I watched a lot of this. I just want to share this with you. This was about a document dealing with protecting and healing God's children. It was really a pastoral document. Listen.
Just a general observation. I noticed the name Jesus Christ hasn't been mentioned in the course of this, and Pope Francis has always mentioned that missionary discipleship is an encounter with Christ that leads to all this. It might not hurt to throw that in there somewhere, perhaps cultivate an ever-deepening spirituality of chastity and virtue as a result of a personal encounter with Christ or something. Hopefully somewhere his name could be mentioned.
Your thoughts on that intervention
there? Yeah, I agree. I'll say, to be fair, at the very top of that list of priorities was evangelization and the outreach to the unaffiliated. And we talked about an evangelizing catechesis. Well, all of that implies, of course, the good news about Jesus Christ. But I agree with Bishop Baker. I think it would be good if we explicitly mentioned the sacred name. But, to be fair, I do think the priorities really are finally about bringing people to an encounter with Christ. But I think the mention of the name might be a good idea.
Yeah, I agree. Bishop Robert Barron, thank you so much for being with us, and we'll check in soon.
Good. God bless you, Raymond.
Thank you. Phil Lawler and Jennifer ROBAK Morse are up next. But first, a little news. The fight over the remains of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen appears to be over. The Archdiocese of New York said this week it will cooperate to transfer Sheen's remains to Peoria, Illinois. This after the court shut down any further appeals by the New York Archdiocese. They have repeatedly ruled in favor of the late Archbishop's family, who requested the body be moved to Peoria. Sheen's cause for sainthood can now proceed once his body is returned to his home diocese. Bishop Daniel Janke of Peoria says he's grateful for the decision. And the Sovereign Military Order of Malta announced this week that it has banned the use of the extraordinary form of the Mass. According to the head of the order, quote, all of the liturgical ceremonies within our order must be performed according to the ordinary rite of the Church and not the extraordinary rite, the Tridentine rite. The Catholic lay group traces its origins back to medieval Jerusalem. The Grand Master cites the cohesion and communion of the order as reasons for the ban. Here now to discuss these stories and a few more, I'm joined by editor of Catholic World News and author of the book, The Smoke of Satan, Phil Lawler, who joins me in studio, and author of the book, The Sexual State, Dr. Jennifer ROBAK Morse, joins us from Louisiana. Thank you both for being here. Francesco Cesario, who's the chairman of the National Review Board, insisted that lay people should be part of the investigation of any bishops charged with wrongdoing. Will this metropolitan model work? Phil Lawler.
No, it can't work. And the reason it can't work is because the metropolitan model assumes that we have confidence in the metropolitan archbishops, and we don't. That's the reason we're having this crisis. Bishop Dealey, in presenting the proposal to the Bishops' Conference, cited or made the argument that the system had worked in the McCarrick and Bransfield cases.
Right.
Well, if those are successes, I'd hate to see a failure. We have people hemorrhaging out of the church, losing confidence in the hierarchy. No, Professor Cesario is right. We don't have confidence in the bishops, and we won't have confidence in their investigations.
Jennifer, the bishops, in fact, I had Bishop Paprocki, we had Bishop Barron on earlier in the show. They say, look, there is a lay component here. There's going to be a board that the first complaints are delivered to, and they may be part of investigations down the line. Is that sufficient in your mind as a researcher and somebody who spent a lot of time looking at the data here?
You know, I agree with what Phil just said. I don't see how lay people just kind of looking over the review board is going to be adequate. What I think is really necessary, Raymond, is for the laity to simply take the bull by the horns and paying attention, adding pressure, putting their own forms of pressure and attention onto the situation. Because no matter what the policies and procedures are, if the laity are asleep at the switch, the bad guys will be able to drive a Mack truck through any kind of policies and procedures. But on the other hand, if we're paying attention, any set of policies and procedures are going to work a whole lot better. And so that's why we're devoted to trying to step up the informal, if you will, activist involvement of the laity.
Jen, I want to talk about your institute. The Ruth Institute put out a report this week that shows that the overall number of homosexual priests have declined in the church since the 1980s, and therefore the number of male victims has declined as well. However, the number of female victims is rising. Why are we seeing this shift?
Well, I think the key thing is what you just said, Raymond, that it appears that there are fewer homosexual men being ordained to the priesthood. And so what we're seeing, if you look historically at the data, what you see is this big spike in male victims, and now that those male victims have declined. But underlying that same data is a sort of steady stream of female victims. So there have always been female victims. But they're going to become relatively more important as we have fewer male victims. So that's in one of the reports, one of the table 14, I think, in our report. You can see very clearly this spike in male victims and just the kind of steady, you know, year in, year out number of female victims. But so there's not a huge amount of movement there.
How numerous are these victims, though? They're declining in the macro, right?
Yeah. Well. Well, actually, yeah, that's one of the things we're quite concerned about. I mean, there was kind of a trough, you might say, around the year 2004, 2002, right around after the Dallas Charter. That seems to be the low point in the number of victims overall. But since then, there has been a disturbing increase in the victims, and so in male and female victims, actually. And so that's why we're calling for continual vigilance. We simply cannot be patting ourselves on the back and saying this is all a historical problem, it's all been solved. That's not the case.
Phil, the bishop offenders we've been seeing, they tend to predominantly fall in one category here, though. Tell me about that, and why do you think we're seeing the predation primarily on males in a lot of these bishop offenders that we're hearing about anyway?
Well, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that there is a network, a homosexual network that promotes within the clergy, so that you have a disproportionate number of homosexual bishops, disproportionate number of homosexual priests in chanceries, and they're taking care of each other. They're looking after each other's interests. And so they rise up the hierarchy and have more opportunity to take care of each other.
Now, Jen, you say in your report, Catholics shouldn't fool themselves that sex abuse crisis is limited to the homosexual clergy. Abuse is abuse. Are you content that the bishops have properly understood the problem, whether it's straight or homosexual in origin?
You know what? I'm not confident at all that the hierarchy appreciates the full scope of this problem or that they're willing really to face it head on. I mean, there's the factor that Phil just mentioned, which is that some of our bishops, sadly, must be complicit. It must be that they're complicit, that they know exactly what's going on, and they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to implicate themselves or their friends. But one of the things we did find in the data is you follow the offenders through time. You know, Father Sullins had data that goes back to 1950, and we follow people through time, and what you see is that there were two kind of waves, you might say, like the ordination classes of around the late 60s, early 70s. The predominant number of abusive clergy were ordained around the same time. So there's two big batches of them, late 60s, early 70s, and then another batch in the 1980s. And if you follow those guys, you see, you know, that they're accounting for at least half of the abuse year in and year out. So that has been a very striking feature of our most recent, very thorough analysis of the data, that you've got a couple pockets there where there were a lot of gay men, I guess, ordained, and as Phil just mentioned, they have aged. They are now occupying positions of authority and power, and that's what we're dealing with.
Jen and Phil, I want to call your attention to something that broke in this week. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano was interviewed by the Washington Post. He did it via correspondence. He responded to nearly 40 questions. The Post chose not to publish selected passages. Now, I have come into possession of an unpublished section that I do want to share with you. In it, the Washington Post asks, do you see any signs that the Vatican under Pope Francis is taking proper steps to address the serious issues of abuse? If not, what's missing? And Vigano says, going back to the summit and its focus on the abuse of minors, I now wish to bring attention to two recent and truly horrifying cases involving allegations of offenses against minors during Pope Francis's tenure. The Pope and many prelates in the Curia are well aware of these allegations, but in neither case was an open and thorough investigation permitted. An objective observer cannot help but suspect that horrible deeds are being covered up. Now, that's the quote. We are not going to reveal all the details of the people he implicates, but the first case involves abuse by a seminarian towards a boy, starting at age 13, and then several fellow seminarians. This, according to Vigano, occurred at the pre-seminary in the walls of the Vatican. The seminarian is now an ordained priest. The whistleblowers were expelled from the seminary, and Vigano alleges that bishops were involved in the cover-up. The second is a case that involves a major Vatican official appointed by Pope Francis, who Vigano contends was involved in terrible immorality and sexual abuse of seminarians. Despite knowing this, his appointment proceeded. Your reaction, Phil Lawler?
Well, this is new to me, and I wish I could say I don't believe it, but I do, because I've heard so many stories along similar lines for so many years. And there's been a culture in the Vatican, not just under Pope Francis, I'm sorry to say it goes back, of covering up, of perhaps doing taking some disciplinary action, but not letting anyone in the public know why the action has been taken. And there's a long culture of this, and this culture extends across the Atlantic. It extends to our bishops. The bishops are not aggressive in investigating each other. They're, on the contrary, aggressive in toning down any investigation.
Jennifer, your thoughts on, and I've seen this pattern, if you will, it's almost vampiric in that you have an offender who then abuses someone and then ordains them. And then it continues on. In some of these cases, one of them that we mentioned just now, you see this pattern. Is this something you've seen in your research? What's going on here?
Well, the amount of detail that you've just revealed here is not something that you generally see in the type of research that we're able to do, because our material is statistical material. But I would just like to register the fact that I'm revolted by this, and I'm sitting here thinking about what is this man's priesthood going to be like if you were abused as a seminarian, if you were abused as a seminarian, if you were an abusive person while you were a seminary, and then you're ordained. what is that doing to somebody's priesthood? And the other thing that I want to point out is that in not our statistical analysis, but our work in interacting with victims of clergy sexual abuse and victims of childhood sexual abuse all across the board, is just how long-lasting the impact of sexual abuse can be. I hear from people who have had nightmares for years, who have PTSD symptoms, who have night terrors, all kinds of problems that do not go away unless they're addressed. And so if you look at it from the perspective of the victim, you know, not only is there no justice for the person, but there can't really be healing because you're pushing the whole thing under the rug. And what really needs to happen is somebody needs to say, this was wrong, this shouldn't have happened, and we're here for you, not for your abuser. That's what needs to be said. And until enough people in the hierarchy are willing to say that, we're not going to get to the bottom of this. And that's where the lay people doggone well better be saying it, because we can't count on our clergy to get that done.
Yeah, no, it's a heartbreaker. And I have to tell you, I hate having to report these things and stay mired in this. I find it revolting. It's so counterproductive for me as a person and a journalist. And you know, I think of families at home having to listen to this. But if we don't report it here, it doesn't get said.
Right.
And it's a very frustrating, awful position, frankly, that I'm put in, and you and Jennifer and all of us. But I've got to go on here. Bishop Gustavo Zanchetta of Argentina was formally charged with abusing seminarians. He may face up to 10 years in prison in his native Argentina. Now, the Vatican claimed they knew nothing of the complaints against him until 2018. However, complaints against him began in 2015. The Pope brought him to the Vatican, even after learning of those complaints, gave him a job, a very good one, running all the Vatican properties, after the allegations were brought to his attention. Phil, your reaction to this?
It's awful in several respects. It just illustrates the depth of the corruption we're dealing with. First of all, do you believe that nobody in the Vatican knew about this back several years ago when the complaints first surfaced? Because I don't believe it. Second, he was not given just any job in the Vatican. As you point out, he was given a job at APSA, which is managing the Vatican investments, which is where the money is. And we all know that corruption and money go hand in hand. This is something we've just learned in West Virginia. So this is the interweaving of the threads of corruption that keep running through. I mean, we absolutely have to sever those threads.
Jennifer, what can be done? I mean, people want to be faithful. They love their church. They want to be a part of it. They want to contribute to it. But then you keep hearing these stories from the highest levels. What can the laity credibly do here?
Well, first of all, my position on this, I share your agony, you know, I mean, the agony that you just described, Raymond. I feel that as well, of course. And my feeling is we don't have the right to leave the church. The church and the deposit of faith was given to us when we were born, when we were little children. This was given to us, and we have a responsibility to hand the deposit of faith on to the people who come behind us. And so to me, it's a no-brainer. We can't leave the church, because if we leave the church, we're leaving it to people like you just described. You know, that's a non-starter. We can't do that. So what can the laity do? One thing that we're trying to do at the Ruth Institute, of course, besides informing people and educating people and so on, is we're trying to give people the tools and the equipment that they might need to confront errant clergy, to confront their bishops, to complain, and to complain in an effective manner. It's very easy for people to wring their hands and moan and complain and all of that, or leave. You know, those are the easy things to do. It's more important to be thinking about what can we do that will get their attention and that will let them know that they're being watched. And if they know they're being watched, maybe they'll behave better, number one. Even if they don't behave better, they'll be nervous knowing somebody's looking over their shoulder. And when people get nervous, they tend to make more mistakes. So that's the approach that we're taking. And I take that approach because it's kind of my inclination personally, but also because there are a lot of us doggone it, there are a lot of faithful people. And if we all get together and all focus on one diocese or one parish or one particular issue where we can have a specific effect on a particular person, that's what we need to do, and we need to do that repeatedly. I mean, we've got a situation here in Lafayette. I don't know if you're aware of this case, Raymond, but there was a case in Lafayette where a deacon's son was molested by a priest, okay? A deacon's son, think about this. This deacon served on the altar with this priest, and the guy was molesting his teenage son. So this priest confessed, he's in jail, and now his attorney is asking for reconsideration of his sentence because that sentence is just so mean it's against the Louisiana State Constitution. Well, I'll tell you what, some of us are writing letters to that judge to make it clear that the public cares about whether that man is, about how long that man is in prison, and that we're not going to sit there and just do nothing while somebody springs him loose. So you know, there's a role of the civil authorities here too.
I've got to move on here to this, and you alluded to the story a moment ago, Phil, the story of Michael Bransfield in West Virginia. Now, this is a bishop who wrote millions of dollars worth of checks to various bishops, checks to priests whom he had allegedly sexually harassed, as well as lavish spending on house renovations, alcohol. I have said we need to investigate these cases, but we have to follow the money trail, and a universal audit might be in order for every diocese in the world. Do you think there are more cases like this one, like Bransfield, out there, and might the money, as you said earlier, be intermingled with the sexual corruption?
I don't think it. I know there are cases like this out there. First, because I hear intimations of it and I hear reports, which I'm not in a position to confirm, but I'm working on it. But second, just look at the reaction to Bishop Bransfield. And I call your attention to one thing particularly. Archbishop Laurie headed the investigation. And then it came out that Archbishop Laurie himself had been on the receiving end of checks. Now, I'm an elected official in the little town where I live, and we have conflict of interest laws. And I know if I have taken gifts from someone, I cannot sit on the panel that investigates that person. It's obvious. It's a
Conflict of interest.
Entry-level understanding of conflict of interest. Well, why didn't Archbishop Laurie
recuse himself?
Why didn't he? I have to assume because this is a common practice. There are checks being written. It's not all that unusual. Archbishop Vigano told the Post that when he was apostolic nuncio here, he started receiving large checks around Christmas time, and he said, what is going on here? This was entirely new to him, but apparently it's not new. There are checks flying around, and this is our money. Jennifer was saying, you know, this is our church. This is our money. Bishops should not be free to do what they want with it, not for pastoral reasons, but for their own self-aggrandizement. That's really wrong.
Yeah, no, it's mind-blowing. When I read of this case, particularly, and you know, Bishop Bransfield ran the financial apparatus for the entire USCCB. We might remind people. It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling at this late date that this is ongoing and may still be ongoing. Anyway, I want to move on.
You know what I like about this,
Go
though?
ahead, Jen.
Sorry, I was just going to say that. You know what I like about this, though, is that sexual sins make people crazy, and because a lot of people have sexual sins, and nobody really wants to get too close and look too closely at other people's sexual sins because maybe their sexual sins will come out. But money. People might just be willing to look at the money because everybody knows you're not supposed to steal. So.
Right. All right. The Vatican, Jen, rejected the notion that gender identity can be fluid in a document released over the weekend, and it seeks to affirm the metaphysical roots of sexual differences to help refute attempts to negate male-female duality of human nature from which the family is generated. Dr. Morse, how important is this document, and do you expect it will be taken up and taught?
Well, I think that part of this document is extremely important. It's very good that the Church has reiterated that point. You wouldn't think it would be necessary to say men and women are different, but in our day and age, it is necessary to say that. And so it's very good that they said it. It would have been a disaster if they had said anything else, that's for sure. The place where I'm a little bit concerned is that they keep talking about dialogue, and I'm not sure who you're supposed to be talking to about this. I think that the basic understanding, the basic reality of male and female, it should not be up for discussion. And we can discuss a lot about how to help people who are struggling with that, or what many aspects of it can be discussed. But I think we need to be real careful about what we're going to talk about here.
I want to move on. The leader of the Knights of Malta made big news this week. He banned all celebrations of the Old Rite, the Old Latin Mass, at official liturgical celebrations within the military order. Now, it has to be done only according to the ordinary form of the Mass. What do you make of this decision? Why is this happening? Why is this important, Phil Lawler?
It's not important for him to do it. It is important that he did it because it's a sign that the powers that be in Rome are cracking down more and more on any sign of support for the old rite, of any sign of not being in lockstep with the liturgical preferences of the current Holy Father. I mean, it's clear as day that the old form, the extraordinary form, is valid, useful, has a role. So why not in the Knights of Malta? It's just a very strange ruling.
Well, some are saying it's a purge. They're trying to purge the traditionally minded members of Malta out.
Well, then they may find another generation or two that they have very few members because, you know, the thing that's not being told about the extraordinary form is it's a youth movement.
Right, right. A lot of young people at that Mass. What do you make of, and Jennifer, I'll ask you this, and I'll go back to Phil before I run out of time. What do you make of this multi-year legal fracas in New York? The Archdiocese of New York wrestling for years in the courts with Joan Cunningham, Sheen Cunningham, who is Archbishop Fulton Sheen's niece, over his remains. Just to make a long story short, at the time when the cause was forwarded, New York would not take it up. It went to Peoria. They began the cause with the understanding that when the time was right, when the canonization was moving forward, the body would be relocated from New York to Peoria. Now, this week, it appears the court has said there are no more options here, and New York is complying with the request. Your thoughts, Jennifer, on how this is perceived and why they're wasting money on this fracas?
Well, I must say, I don't know why they're wasting money on such a fracas. It's very unseemly and unfortunate that it has come this far, but I think it's good that it's being resolved. And I think sending the remains back to Peoria is probably the best thing.
Yeah, why not just divide the remains, Phil? That was done all over the church.
Oh.
I mean, you know, you've got St. Anthony's tongue here and his head's over here. This happens. It's a way of spreading the wealth, if you will.
Well, maybe that might be the Solomonic decision to ask people, the two dioceses, if they want to split it and see who objects. But I think it is very unseemly. It's nasty. It seems to be a happy ending that the cause will now be moving forward, probably very quickly, I'm told.
Yeah.
So,
So we'll see what happens there. Finally,
I just hope more people will read his things.
Yeah, that's true. They'll read his works, and that could be a good thing. Finally, last week, Cardinal Walter Casper said, if this upcoming synod on the Amazon agreed that married men could be priests and proposed such a change to Pope Francis, he would probably, in principle, accept it. What do you think of that idea? And do you think the bishops will agree to this? Jennifer.
I can't predict what the bishops will or will not agree to, but I can tell you one thing. Our Paul Sullins here at the Ruth Institute is himself a married Catholic priest because he was once Episcopalian. He's also a sociologist and has written a book on married Catholic priests, so he knows more about the subject than anyone. And he would tell you flat out that a married clergy is no panacea for the sexual abuse crisis. And whatever other implications there may be, it will not solve the sex abuse crisis.
Phil, I hear there's also going to be openings here about a possible reinterpretation of what communion can mean, and perhaps an expansion in the understanding and reception of communion, as well as this question of ordaining married men.
that's more troubling to me. There are married Catholic priests. That can be done. I don't think it's a good idea, but it has been done. It is done in the Eastern churches.
Right.
But reinterpreting communion, now you're getting to the very core of our faith. And that troubles me. It troubles me particularly because in recent synods, nothing much has happened that didn't have the prior approval of the Holy Father. So if it's rumored to be happening, the rumor is probably being circulated out of the Apostolic Palace.
Phil, Jennifer, thank you both for being here. The Smoke of Satan by Philip Lawler and The Sexual State by Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse are available at bookstores everywhere and online. Thanks for being here. Before we go, she was the matriarch of New Orleans cuisine when she passed away earlier this month at the age of 96. Leah Chase fed civil rights leaders, musicians, and presidents in her 7-decade career. She was the ruler of the kitchen at Dookie Chase's restaurant, the establishment founded by her late husband. She was also a very serious Roman Catholic. I had a chance to know Leah. She took part in one of our Christmas specials, the one I shot for PBS. And she really takes a lot of New Orleans history with her. But her undeniable legacy will live on. Here's a little bit of Leah Chase.
One woman who's been telling it like it is for decades is Leah Chase. At 93, she is still in Tremé, cooking her famous gumbo and fried chicken as she has for 70 years. The winner of the James Beard Lifetime Achievement Award, Leah is the proprietor and chef at Dookie Chase.
You know, it used to be a meeting place, and I feel that in some ways we changed the course of America right in here.
Duke Ellington, Rosa Parks, several presidents, and Martin Luther King all ate within these walls.
And everybody would meet here over a bowl of gumbo. Just have gumbo and fried chicken.
Today, Leah Chase is the undisputed queen of Creole cooking.
Now, they're Creoles and they're Creoles, what we call the Creoles de couleur, my dear, the Creoles of color. I might have a little French, a little Spanish, whatever we picked up along the way, but a whole lot of African. And that's what makes this city so unique, is we have a blend of people and a blend of food.
They had a great second line after her funeral mass. It was quite an event in New Orleans. She was a remarkable woman, a great New Orleanian. May Miss Leah Chase rest in peace. And I want you to be sure to watch the show next week. I'll talk to Dr. Jenny Stepanek about the latest news of her son's cause for sainthood. And for those of you in the D.C. area, the 15th anniversary memorial mass for Maddie Stepanek will be celebrated on Saturday, June 22nd at St. Francis Catholic Church in Darewood, Maryland. All the details are at maddiematters.org. School's out and summer reading season is here. Will Wilder 3, The Amulet of Power. Heck, the whole Will Wilder series is available at bookstores everywhere. It makes a great summer read. I love I'm getting pictures of kids who are receiving their Amazon copies or their EWTN catalog copies in the mail. Keep reading. Let me know what you think of the books. That's all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. Go on. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to catch us next week. Dr. Jenny Stepanek will be here and many others. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.